that reading, that prayer, came from the Ojibwe, and we are on Ojibwe lands. Like many of you, I grew up in an era where the real history of Native Americans wasn't taught in schools. Instead, they indoctrinated us with the white colonialist false narratives about Native Americans. So we heard the stories of Squanto and Plymouth Rock and the First Thanksgiving and Pocahontas and others. Such white American history ignores and omits not only Native Americans, the real history of Native Americans, but also other Black, Indigenous people of color. So I learned about Native American cultures, plural, as an adult, and it was an intentional process. I realized that when I was living in Wisconsin, I realized that I knew absolutely nothing about the Native peoples of Wisconsin, and I had nothing to fall back on for my education. Who were the people who lived here, whose culture we still share, and what's going on in our world today? So when I travel, I try to learn about the Native peoples of the region where I go to. I visited Native American museums and cultural centers in Palm Springs, Santa Fe, Seattle, Oklahoma, Washington, D.C., Wisconsin, Illinois, and with you guys a year ago in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. I've read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Banned Books Week just ended. This book has been banned in various southern states and school districts because it disproves the white colonial narrative of North America. Many Unitarian Universalist congregations are on a similar path as I am, and CUUB is one such congregation. We're learning about our Native American neighbors, or we have an intentionality about learning about the Native tribes of this area. For the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing in 2020, the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly adopted an action of immediate witness that was called 400 Years of White Supremacist Colonialism. Recall that the Puritans aboard the Mayflower were the spiritual religious forebearers of Unitarianism. The resolution calls for us as congregations and individuals to educate ourselves about the Native American peoples of our regions. It seeks social justice action in cooperation with, in relationship with local tribes and councils. And it invites us to allyship alongside Indigenous communities. It promotes decolonizing efforts such as establishing an Indigenous Peoples Day, including Indigenous peoples' histories in public education, and eliminating racist monuments, flags, and mascots. And congregations are specifically and especially invited to learn about the Native peoples connected to the land that our congregations are actually on. So for such work, many Unitarian Universalist congregations, including CUUB, adopted land acknowledgments, which we read earlier today, which we occasionally during the year read during services to remind ourselves about these commitments that we have undertaken. These acknowledgments are not an end-all, but a recognition that there is something that we are trying to do, that there is something that we are trying to do better, that we are seeking to find right relationships with the Native peoples around us. So what are some of the things that we're up to? Here's another announcement, sort of squeezed into the message. So on a Sunday in November, and I forget which day it is, I forget which day in November, CUUB is planning what?
The 9th.
The 9th. CUUB is planning a Native American meal for us to learn about Native cuisines. The recipes are going to be coming from a cookbook from the Smithsonian Museum of the Native American. It's called the Mitsitam Cafe Cookbook. They reflect Native recipes and cultures from all over the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. And by the way, the Ojibwe term for the United States is Chi Mukuman Kiing. Also, there's another opportunity. The Detroit Institute of Art has started an exhibit called Contemporary Anishinabe Art, a continuation. Apparently there was an exhibit before, and here's the second part of that exhibit. So let's figure out a day when we, a group of us, maybe 18 of us, like the movie night last night, can go and see the exhibit together sometime in the near future. It would be a cool field trip to Detroit, to downtown Detroit, and then we can go eat in some local eatery over there. Here's another Anishinaabe story from Francis Pegamagabo, or something under. Not only was life sacred in the Anishinaabe worldview, but there were also expectations for how they conducted themselves in the world. It was important for people to hear and live by these teachings. I know some of you hunt wild game, and fall is hunting season. An Anishinaabe person knows about hunting. A good hunter is not someone who has a good aim and can catch a deer. No, not at all. If you kill a deer, it is not because you are a skillful hunter. Don't think of yourself to be a good shot. It was meant for you to kill that deer when you hunt. You are blessed with that deer. You bring that deer home and feed however many people you might have in your family. And that which is left over from the deer, a good hunter would give away. You would go around and give away that meat so that others may eat. You are not to think that this is all for yourself because you give this away. The way that something is given to you is how you are to give it. If you do not give anything, then there is nothing you will receive. You are to give back whatever good may happen to you in life. My comment, does that pay it forward? You are to give back in the same way that the kind Spirit has given things to you, for the Spirit gives freely. This is what is expected of a good hunter. Let's take a breath. Think about the implications of that story, the meaning. It's such a different sensibility about hunting than we have. The Anishinaabe story highlights the importance of community and that you are doing things for the members of your community. And of course, the community supports itself and all of its members. No one is left alone or isolated. Food is freely foraged or hunted and then shared with everyone who needs the food. The story also highlights the traditional Anishinaabe way of life. Hunting and fishing were their core practices for sustenance. However, the story is told after the Anishinaabe have adopted agricultural practices and became sedentary, and also after they were forced to settle on reservations. So their way of life had already changed, was already changing when this story was told. They were losing their traditional hunting sensibilities in these new constrained circumstances. So Michigan has 12 federally recognized Native American tribes. And the total size of the Native American reservations in Michigan is 488.43 square miles. Okay, what does that number mean? So all of Michigan, 1% of both hands is what the Native American reservations, the size of the 1% of this. The native land is their home, the place where their ancestors live, where their ancestors were buried. And many of them were violently forced from their lands, losing part of their identity and heritage as they had to leave the land that they lived on for generations, because they felt this deep connection, this deep relationship with their native land. Native land is especially sacred for First Peoples. It is a sensibility that we as white folks do not share. It is outside of our worldview to have such a deep connection to the land that you live on, the land that your ancestors have lived on, the land where you hunt and fish and forage on. So this is a challenge for us to grasp this fundamental Native concept. So what happened after that? In many cases, these reservations, 1% of all of this, these reservations were so small that the tracts of land could not support the amount of people relocated to those tracts. This led to malnutrition, starvation, disease, and further decimation of the native populations. The federal government stepped in, and they would provide beef, flour, and sugar to supplement their diets. Beef, flour, and sugar. None of that rings true of the traditional Native American diet. These supplements were both unhealthy and alien to them. As a result, Native peoples could no longer maintain their traditional way of life. They had to leave their lands or reservations to find gainful employment to support themselves and their families. They were drafted into armies and sent off to wars. Francis Pegamagabo was drafted, and he served in World War I as a rifleist. His son Duncan says because of his great hunting skills, he was able to handle the rifle so well. All of this led to a loss of cultural identity and language. And the problem was even further exacerbated because around the time of World War I and before World War I, boarding schools were established to essentially rip Native children from their families and put them into educational institutions where they would not learn their native language, they would not learn their native culture, they would not learn about their traditions. Instead, they were forced to learn English and become quote-unquote American. They were in fact forbidden to speak their languages in these places. They were forbidden to practice their cultural and religious rituals. And moreover, these children, with no parents to guide them, also had no elders to teach them the native ways in the boarding schools. The story that we heard also highlights the relationship between humans and nature. Native people see themselves in a balanced relationship with the natural world around them. They take what they need for food, clothing, medicine, for their homes, and they share what they take with those who need it in turn. And then when they are done using it, they return those items to nature. Anishinabe ceremonies commemorate the relationship between humans and nature. And a very important Anishinaabe ceremony is the Sweat Lodge. It was a primary ceremony for reflection, renewal, and relationship restoration amongst clan members. In other stories, Duncan explains the deep significance of the Sweat Lodge for the Anishinaabe. However, federal laws banned these native ceremonies, the Sweat Lodge in particular, all religious native ceremonies, in efforts to force native peoples to adopt Christianity. So we're back to the issue of the separation of church and state. And it's a hot issue today, and of course in this moment I can't shut up. ICE and the National Guard are attacking peaceful Christian pastors and protesters in prayer with rubber bullets and tear gas in the cities of our country. That is not separation of church and state, and that is the type of violence that was enacted on the native peoples of this country as well. In the meantime, Congress turns a blind eye to these atrocities happening in our own country, while the administration perpetuates its pathological lies about eradicating anti-Christian bias in the government. Tell me, how is shooting peaceful Christian protesters not an act of anti-Christian bias? Things changed in 1978 for the Native Americans. Congress passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which restored sacred sites, sacred objects, sacred artifacts that were stolen and brought to museums, for example, and also religious rituals to the Anishinabe and all Native Americans. To practice one's own culture, to practice one's own religion is a fundamental human right, guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution, also guaranteed by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whatever the Anishinaabe do today, they always do it with the very broad perspective of future generations. How will this affect our children? And how will this affect our children's children? They act not only for themselves, but also unto generations into the future. And when they talk about the children, they're not only talking about their own biological children, they're talking about the children of the community, the children of their clan, because in this social network, that is the larger extended family to which people belong to. As Unitarian Universalists, in our efforts to correct our historic wrongs of our past behavior with the native peoples of this great continent, we're invited to become and to be allies with native peoples. But in order to be an ally, we have to have a relationship. And honestly, we here at CUUB don't have many opportunities to interact with the nearby Ojibwe in our immediate area, because they're really not so close by. You know, they're an hour or so. The closest reservation is over an hour's drive away from here. But we can still learn about them and support their culture. Today, the Anishinaabe continue to maintain their cultural heritage, although many have adopted to modern life and they live in urban and rural settings. Francis' son Duncan shares that the hardest part of Anishinaabe life today is the ever-present grief that comes from the constant loss of life and dignity as a people, a heritage that has passed and is missing. I'm ending with a final story, a final Anishinaabe story. This one isn't coming from Francis, but from his wife Ava, after Francis died. And their son Duncan is again retelling the story. It's Duncan in this story who's struggling with his native identity and his indoctrinated Catholic Christian religion. He was afraid that the Christian God would abandon him if he stopped going to church and took up following native ways. So his mother Ava says to him, "It's not necessary for you to go over to that big church in order to see the Spirit," she says. "Wherever it is that you look, you see the Spirit. In the way that a flower grows there in front of you, that is the Spirit. And again, in the way that the leaves of trees flutter in the wind, that is the Spirit. You don't have to go to church. It is everything. The Spirit is in everything that you look at, and also in your fellow human beings. This is the one. This is the Spirit." So I invite you now to turn around and look up into nature through our windows and recognize the presence of the Spirit in nature and our connection to that nature. And remember, she said, the Spirit is in your fellow human being. So I invite you now to take a look at each other and see the Spirit that is present in each one of us, in each one of you. The Ojibwe term for thank you is miigwech.